All right. Now, authorization through NTFS. Again, let's just run through it. So user accounts and passwords provide the foundation for securing a Windows computer, enabling users to authenticate with a PC. After you've created a user account, you need to determine what the user can do with the available resources. And the resources might be files, folders, applications, and so on. We call this process authorization. Windows uses the powerful NT file system, or NTFS, as the primary tool for providing authorization. So let's dive into that and see how it protects files and folders. NTFS permissions. Everybody has heard that term before, right? So in Windows, every folder and file on an NTFS partition has a list that contains two sets of data. First, the list details every user and group with access to that file or folder. And second, the list specifies the level of access each user or group has to that file or folder. The level of access is defined by a set of restrictions called NTFS permissions. NTFS permissions define exactly what any particular account can or cannot do to the file or folder, and are thus quite detailed and powerful. You can, for example, set up NTFS permissions, allowing a user to edit a file but not delete it. You can also configure NTFS permissions to enable any member of a user group to create a subfolder for a particular folder. NTFS file and folder permissions are so complicated that entire books have been written on them. Fortunately, your exam tests your understanding of only a few basic concepts of the NTFS permissions, which include ownership, take ownership permission, change permission, and then your folder permissions and your file permissions. What is ownership? Well, on an NTFS system, anytime you create a new file or folder, you become the owner of that file or folder. When we say you, we mean your user account, right? The account that you use to authenticate into the PC. Owners can do anything they want to the files or folders they own, including changing the permissions to prevent anybody, even administrators, from accessing them, right? So if I own a file, but I'm not the administrator on the system, I can change the permission to stop the administrator from accessing that file. Okay? Everybody understand that? Okay. I'm assuming yes. Take ownership permission is another permission that you may be granted depending on your account level. If you are an administrator within an NT system or an NTFS system, right? So with the take ownership permission, anyone with the permission can seize control of a file or folder. Administrator accounts have take ownership permission for everything. Note the difference here between owning a file and accessing a file. If you own a file, you can prevent anyone from accessing that file. An administrator whom you blocked, however, can take that ownership away from you and then access that file. Does everybody understand the take ownership permission and why it's important? Okay. Can anybody think of an example where you might want to use the take ownership permission? All right, guys. One of the routine jobs that you would be required to do as a technician, right, is to perform backups. So let's say a system failed, right? The hard drive crashed, so Windows can no longer boot from it. They're replacing the drive, but then they need to copy the files across from the old drive to the new drive. However, they had a user account with a password, right? And all of the files were protected by the admin account and ownership on the drive. Meaning, when you plug up that drive to your computer, you are not able to access the files and folders that you need to back up. What you can do, or what you will have to do actually, is actually take ownership permission, meaning the new user account that you're using would now have to take ownership of all of the files and folders that you need to back up before you can transfer it to the new computer to actually perform that backup. Okay, so that's where that comes in. Of course, you could use it too as an administrator, simply gain access to a file that a regular user block you from, but of course that's more inconsequential. All right, change permission. Another important permission for all NTFS files and folders is the change permission. An account with this permission can give or take away permissions for other accounts. All right, that's straightforward enough. Folder permissions. Folder permissions define what a user may do to a folder. One example might be list folder contents, which gives a permission to see what's in a folder. And we're going to look at folder permissions in a little bit. And folder permissions are similar, but not the same as file permissions. File permissions define what a user may do to an individual file. So for instance, you cannot list the contents of a file, right? You would simply have permission to read the file or access the file or not access the file, right? So the examples of the permission you might have on file permissions are read and execute, which would allow you to read it. And if it's an executable file, allow you to execute it. The primary way to set NTFS permissions is through the Security tab under the File or Folder Properties. How do we get to the Security tab? So let's create a folder that we can use as an example here. I'm going to delete that folder first of all. I'll create a new folder on the desktop. And again, we're going to call that folder A+ for our A+ class. Everybody can see that folder that I created on my desktop, yes? A+ folder.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
All right. So how do we get to the Security tab to set the permissions? Anybody can tell me?
Right click on the folder properties.
Right click on the folder with properties, right? And then we have the Security tab. The Security tab will tell us who has access to the folder or the file, if it's a file that we're clicking on. In this case, we're looking at the A+ folder. We can see that my account, the admin account, administrators, and system has access to that. I could edit, right, and deny administrators access to it. Well, I can't deny the administrators group, unfortunately, right? And I probably can't deny the system either. No. All right, so you have to have those. But I could decide that that file, I want members of the DS group. Remember, I have a DS group on that computer, right? I could say that I want members of the DS group, right, to have full control over that folder, right? So I just added them. So the permission they have now is they can read and execute, they can list folder contents, and they can read. However, they cannot write, meaning they cannot save things in that folder, and they cannot modify the contents of the folder, right? Or actually, it's not expressly provided for them to do so, but they're not denied that as well. I can allow them full control, which would give them full control to do everything in that folder, or I could allow them permission to modify, right? Read, write, and execute, but don't give them full control. So let's say I don't want them to write to the folder. They can see the contents of the folder and access them, but they would not be able to save things in that folder. I can actually deny them write permission. So with the write permission denied, nobody in the DS group can actually write to that folder. They will be denied. However, even if I'm in the DS group, I have full permission here, full control, because I am the owner of that file, or that folder, sorry. All right, so I will be able to access it through this permission here, not the DS permission. So pretty much that's how you add permissions to a folder, or you deny permissions from any particular body to a folder. All right. If you just wanted to make it easy and you wanted to make everybody have access to it, you want to make it public, you could actually search for everyone and add everyone and give everybody full permission, and then that folder becomes a free for all. Anybody that has access to your computer can access that folder. Everybody get that? Everybody see how we adjust the security options and determine who can access that particular resource. In this case, it's a folder here. And everybody see the folder permissions. We have full control. We have modify, read and execute, list folder contents, read, write, and special permissions. Let me deny. So I'm going to remove the DS group permission to access that folder. So I simply click on the group, I click remove, and now people in the DS group, to them that folder is invisible. Well, actually no, because everyone can get it here. Let me remove everyone as well. Remove, apply, and now we're back to just me and the administrators being able to access that folder. Right, okay. So we simply come here and edit. Everybody get that? We have advanced permission. We're gonna come to that in a while, but advanced permission will allow you to share it and do different things. Control inheritance. All right. Everybody get that so far? Folder permissions, basically that one. All right, cool. So we just looked at it. They're the standard NTFS permissions: full control, modify, read, and execute, list folder contents, read, write. File permissions. So let us create a file. I'm going to use that same A+ folder. Let's just open it up. Open it in the next screen, right? And I'm going to just create a random file in that folder. So right click in it, new, and let's create a new text document, which is a file. Let's call it my file.txt, right? And let's look at the permission for that file. So if I right click on it, go to properties, and we go in the very same place, the security tab. Notice the same user has shared it, and the same system and administrators group have access to it. All right. I can edit the permissions the same way, but my permissions are a little bit different. We have full control, modify, read and execute, read, write, special permissions. So that is your file permissions. And you would edit the permissions the same way. You could add users to it, or delete users, remove users from it. Everybody get that, right? Straightforward enough?
Yes, sir.
All right. So a few important points about NTFS permissions. You may see the NTFS permissions on the folder or file by accessing the properties dialog box for that file or folder and opening the security tab. That's what we were just doing. NTFS permissions are assigned both to user accounts and groups, although it's considered the best practice to assign permissions to groups and then add user accounts to groups instead of adding permissions directly to individual user accounts. And we just saw that. We saw my Leonard Green account, which is a user account. And we have the DS group, which we can essentially manipulate the same way. We can apply the permission to a single user or to a group to apply to multiple users at once. Permissions are cumulative, which means if you have full control on a folder and only read permission on a file in that folder, you get full permission on that file, which was the reason why if I add the DS group, but I deny them write permission, but I myself as Leonard Green, the Leonard Green account has full permission, I maintain full permission to that file or that folder, all right? Whoever creates the folder or file has complete control over that folder or file, and that is called ownership. Administrators do not automatically have complete control over every folder and file. If an administrator wants to access a folder or file they do not have permission to access, they may go through a process called take control. Does anybody know how to go through the process called take control? All right. So, all right, it's pretty straightforward. I don't have an example set up for you right now, but in the event you try accessing a file or folder that you do not have permission to, as an administrator, you're going to get an error saying you do not have permission to access this folder or this file, whatever the case may be, right? And it will actually ask you if you would like to take permission to access it. Essentially, you tell it yes, and it goes through the process. It might take a minute or two, depending on how large the folder is and how many files are in there, the subfolders and so on. And then when it's done, essentially, as the administrator, you now have ownership permission on that resource, whether it be a file or a folder. So it's pretty straightforward. The important thing is you have to be logged into an administrator account on the computer that you're working on. All right, and then whenever you access a file you do not have permission to access, it gives you the option to take control. It'll also ask if you want to apply the same to all folders and subfolders and files within that folder. If it's a folder, you simply tell it yes to gain ownership over the entire folder and everything in it. Take some time to think about these permissions. Why would Microsoft create them? Think of situations where you might want to give a group modify permission. Also, you can assign one-on-one permission. In many situations, we like to give users both the read and write permissions. So anybody has any questions on those permissions, file, folder permissions, ownership, take ownership? Any questions on any of that? No? We're all good? All right. Quick note, Windows editions for home use. In other words, anytime you hear Windows 10 Home or Home Premium or anything for home use, would have a limited set of permissions that you can assign. As far as folder permissions go, you can assign only one, make this folder private. So if you're on the home versions of Windows, you may not see all of these options, right? But the make this folder private essentially would make only your user account access that folder, right? And to see this in action, right click on a file or folder, select sharing and security from the options. Note you can't just select properties and see the security tab like you can in the professional oriented editions of Windows. Windows Home editions do not have file level permissions. So you have folder level, but not file level permissions. If you want to get all of those permissions that I just showed you, you need to have Windows professional versions, all right? Professional, corporate, enterprise, any of those. They work the same way in the home version, just limited options, right? Okay, moving on to inheritance. Can anybody tell me, explain to me the concept of inheritance? What is inheritance? When your parents die, they leave land and money for you. That is inheritance, right?
Yeah, okay, what what I understand by that, whatever permission, well, I would say
You're going on the right track. Is the permissions, yeah?
whatever permission that you, that is within a folder, any file you put in that folder will inherit those permissions.
Well, you're assuming that inheritance automatically means you will inherit, but yes. So inheritance is the process of determining the default permissions any newly introduced files or subfolders containing a folder received. So with inheritance, you might also have inheritance being dropped and the permissions not being carried over. It depends on a few things, such as the file system that you use it. All right. So let's look at it. Inheritance is a huge issue, as we tend to make lots of folder and file changes in our system. We need to let NTFS know what we want to do when new files and folders suddenly appear. So the base rule of Windows inheritance is that any new files and folders placed into a folder automatically gets all of the NTFS permissions of the parent folder. So if you copy a file from an old folder into a new folder, the file will get the permissions that the new folder has. So if, for example, you have read and execute access to a folder and someone else copies a file to that folder, you will automatically get read and execute permissions on that file in that folder that you have read and execute permissions on. In other words, the file will inherit the permissions of the parent folder. Okay? All versions of Windows have inheritance turned on by default, which most of the time is a good idea. If you access a folder's properties dialog box, click on the Security tab, click on the Advanced button over just there. You will see the little checkbox that says Include inheritable permissions from this object parents. If you wanted to turn off inheritance, you would just uncheck this box. Don't do that. Inheritance is good. Inheritance is expected. So just to demonstrate properties, security, advanced, you have the option to disable inheritance there, right? Or replace all child objects with entries with inheritable permission entries from these objects, right? So that's where you would go to configure that. Now, if you look closely at figure 1426, you will see that there are a number of grayed out NTFS allow permissions. That's how Windows tell you that the permissions here are inherited. Grayed out checkboxes can't be changed. So what to do if you need to make a change here? So let me just give you the example again here. If we go on the security, notice for administrator and system, these are grayed out, right? If let's look at it here. See, these are grayed out. Yeah, meaning I cannot actually change them. And that's because the administrators group has access to my desktop by default. Right? So that is an inherited permission. We cannot change it. In rare situations, you may want to turn off inheritance for a specific folder or file. Instead of shutting down inheritance completely, use the deny checkbox. Clicking the deny checkbox for a particular NTFS permission tells Windows to overrule inheritance and stop that particular NTFS permission. So the deny checkbox always overrides NTFS inheritance. Yeah. So if you wanted to ensure that the system couldn't access that file, you could deny it the permission to access. Right? You cannot not allow it, but you can deny it. All right, so that is inheritance. Let's look at permission propagation. Basically, everybody know what propagation is? If you know agriculture, propagation is when you move a plant from one place to another, like you have it in a pot and you move it to the ground or something like that, right? So permission propagation is a process of determining what NTFS permissions are applied to files that are moved or copied, meaning propagated, to a new folder. Be careful here. You might be tempted to think, given what you've just learned about inheritance, that any new files or folders copied or moved into a folder would just inherit the folder's permissions, right? But this is not always true, and you need to know it. It really depends on two issues: whether the data is being copied, meaning you copying it, or moved, meaning you cutting it and pasting it, right? So is it a copy and paste or cut and paste? And whether the data is coming from the same volume or a different one. So we need to consider four situations: copying the data within one NTFS based volume, moving data within one NTFS based volume, and copying data between two NTFS based volumes, and moving data between two NTFS based volumes. And then we also look at when we move it to non-NTFS based volumes afterwards. So let's look at that. Copying within a single volume creates two copies of the object. The copy of the object in the new location inherits the permissions from that new location, meaning the new copy can have different permissions than the original. So when you copy in within a single NTFS based volume, meaning you copy in from my documents to my pictures, right? On that same C drive, then the permission will be inherited from the new location. If you move in within a volume, meaning you cut and paste, right? The object retains its permissions unchanged. So if you create a copy, it will inherit the permissions of the new locations. If you move the file, it will move with its original permissions. Copying from one NTFS volumes to another creates two copies. A copy of the object in the new location inherits the permission from that new location. Moving from one NTFS volume to another creates one copy of the object. The object in the new location inherits the permissions from that new location. So whether you copy or move, the new file will inherit the permissions from that new location. Everybody get that? That little table explains it nicely. From a text standpoint, you need to be aware of how permissions can change when you move or copy files. If you're in doubt about a sensitive file, check it before you sign up to a client. Where that will really come in is when you have multiple users on a system, more likely a network, right? And some users are expressly denied permissions up to files, right? And you want to maintain those permissions, okay? If you're working with the government, for instance, you have levels like confidential, secret, top secret. If you don't have top secret clearance, you shouldn't be able to see any things that are classified as top secret, right? So when they say only the top secret group can access that file or that folder, if you're not a member of the top secret group, you simply just don't have access to it, right? And you don't want to move those files to anywhere where anybody who doesn't have top secret clearance can get access to it. So you want to be careful how you move and copy files when you're dealing with those levels of clearances, okay? That's a little bit high end, but I think it explains the point of permission propagation. Any questions on that? Any questions? We all good? All right, I'm assuming that everybody is okay. Let me just run through that section really quickly. Text and permissions. You need local administrative privileges to change almost anything on a Windows machine, such as install updates, change drivers, install applications. Most administrators hate giving out administrative permissions for obvious reasons. If an administrator does give you administrative permission for a PC and something goes wrong with that system while you're working on it, you immediately become the primary suspect. If you're working on a system administered by someone else, make sure he or she understands what you're doing and how long you think it will take. Have the administrator create a new account for you that's a member of the administrators group. Never ask for the password to a permanent administrator account. If you need administrator permission, they should create a new account for you and grant you access to the administrators group. They should not just tell you, well, the password is 45XY. Granted, again, in our society, people tend to do that if they trust you. But as a tech, you want to indemnify yourself, because if the person top secret information get leaked and you the only person with the password, you are at fault, okay? So you don't want to be blamed if anything goes wrong on the system. Well, Janet tell me the password when she installed the new hard drive. So, well, I told Janet the password, so maybe she did it. Or I tell Clyde the password, so it's Clyde that mess it up. No, not that it mess up. All right. And when you finish with the system, you make sure the administrator delete the account you use. Well, that is on the administrator end. They can either delete the account you use, they might disable it because it might be ongoing and you might be coming back later, or they might remove you from the administrators group if you need access to the system but no longer need administrative privileges. Okay. This protect yourself from password attitudes applies to areas other than just doing tech support in Windows. PC support folks get lots of passwords, scan cards, keys, and ID tags. New techs tend to get an I can go anywhere and access anything attitude, and that is dangerous. I've seen jobs lost and friendships ruined when a backup suddenly disappears or a critical file gets erased. Everybody points to the support techs in those situations. In physical security situations, make other people unlock doors for you. Basically, these are just tips to indemnify yourself in the event of dealing with classified and sensitive information where permissions are critical. All right. I always tell my clients, I do not know passwords. I do not want their passwords. I'm not expected to remember their passwords. Even if they give me their passwords, I let them know, listen, do not ask me for it. And I've had that situation many times. A client called me out of the blue on a Sunday. Mr. Green, do you know my password because I forget it? Or you know our password to access that because we forget it, nobody don't know it. And again, I'm going to leave it for you to judge how you deal with your clients. If you have regular clients you deal with, you provide ongoing support, how you deal with that. But if you're dealing with a one-off clients, my recommendation is leave their passwords to them, let them remember it. If they forget the password, then they need to face the consequences, all right? It might mean they need to pay you to recover access or whatever the case might be, but they need to face the consequences. Do not make it your burden, even if they give it to you, all right? This little section, permissions on Linux and Mac OS X, it explains it in fairly good detail, but unfortunately, we do not have Linux or Mac. I have a Linux server running in the background there, but it's not available for us to use right now. And I don't have any Mac for us to jump in the terminal and do any of those. But I want you guys to just read through it. The A+ exam does focus on Windows, right? So you don't have to worry about not actually getting the practice. But read through it and at least understand how the permissions are applied, right? And of course, if you ever have to work on a Linux or a Mac system and you have to change permissions, well, you should have a copy of that book. You can always reference it or Google it, but at least you're familiar with how it works. In the interest of time, I'm actually not gonna go through it. I'm gonna leave it for you to go through, right? Including commands, right? And we're going to jump down into sharing resources securely. Again, I sort of browse through that with you guys, but let's do it. Actually, I see our timer is telling me we have 2 minutes and 48 seconds. So what I'm gonna do, we're gonna stop here and come back in for one last session to just wrap up. It should take us more than about 10, 15 minutes. All right. But in the 2 minutes that we have left, does anybody have any questions on anything that we've covered so far?